remember telling my college professor I wanted to study xenoarchaeology. He laughed right in my face. "There's nothing to study," he said. "It's all dead space."
Oh, so that's why it's called Dead Space.
Let's get looking, dead boy. That's not funny.
All good things must come to an end. Sometimes a series just runs out of steam. In other cases, executive meddling gets in the way of a project that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Dead Space 3 is a case of the latter. While it's not as bad as I was expecting due to its reputation, Dead Space 3 does fall short of the masterclass of game design that were the first two titles. Looking to reach a larger audience, a number of compromises were made to the formula. Horror was dialed back, action was dialed up. Co-op was integrated into the game. Dead Space 3 also suffered from being one of the first major big-budget single-player titles with microtransactions. The end result ends up being a compromised title. Design decisions that were in conflict with the foundation of what Dead Space is. There's still plenty that's great here, as Visceral were a very talented team. They're making the most of a bad situation. It's a cliche, but it's one of the many examples of EA getting its own way of its own products. In trying to squeeze out more money from customers, they end up losing in the long run. Dead Space 2 would sell well with around 4 million sales. In order to justify continuing the franchise, 5 million units of Dead Space 3 were set as the goal. This would not happen, and the franchise was put on hold. Visceral Studios would be shut down 4.5 years later in October of 2017. So let's take a closer look at Dead Space 3, and why it didn't hit the mark that the first two titles in the series did. How it ended up being the death of the series for many years before being brought to life in a remake format. There are a number of tweaks to the gameplay that results in a mixed bag for Dead Space 3. The horror has been dialed back and the action has been dialed up. Sure, the same case happened with Dead Space 2, but there the horror was mostly maintained. As a result, the gameplay tweaks clash with the foundations that Dead Space was built on. You now have the ability to roll and crouch. Handy, but you know what would have been even more handy? A quick turn. In development for the first Dead Space, the team mentioned they had this. However, they had enough actions mapped to buttons and cut it. I still wish this was added in at some point. A major addition to Dead Space 3 is a cover system, because to sell more copies, that's what your game needs for 2013. A cover system. There's gun-wielding enemies we now deal with, both humans and necromorphs with guns. I'm not opposed to this. After all, Isaac has caused plenty of hassle to others, unitologists especially. Overall, it's a minimal portion of combat. Most of the game is dealing with necromorphs just like we have in the past. And besides, even in most cases, I wouldn't even just use cover and just run up and kill enemies. The cover system here is very bare bones. Crouch up to some cover and you're done. There's no snap to cover or moving back and forth between cover button. So when you enter an area of chest-high objects, you know what to expect. Although there are some cases where a combat area will pull double duty. One time through can be encounter with the Stalker necromorphs, a welcome return. Another pass through the same area later might be an encounter with humans. Again, I found myself more often than not just bypassing cover and firing away. The necromorphs with guns feel like a bit of a missed opportunity. They behave in the same way like the gun-toting enemies in Resident Evil 6. There's a bit of a delay and they'll use an arcing path towards you. However, they're present for a cup of coffee and then they're gone. There could have been a nice mixture of having them along with other necromorphs present. Worry about those charging us along with those with guns further back. It also would benefit the game more if the guns used against us did more damage. They really dialed back the overall difficulty here. Look how long this death takes to happen on normal mode. Necromorphs have been tweaked as well, and not for the better. The action approach creeps its way into these changes. Necromorphs are much faster. Dismemberment here is dialed back in its effectiveness. Precision aiming isn't as emphasized. Having at least one auto weapon is recommended as a result. This all clashes with the foundational design of Dead Space. Precise aiming for dismemberment to save your ammo. The ammo system has an overhaul as well, which I'll cover shortly. Overall, it's a compromise that hinders Dead Space 3 instead of adding to it. Although the Isaac Stomp dance is still plenty of fun to do. As well for enemies, there weren't any new enemies here in Dead Space 3 that jumped out at me, both figuratively and literally. Enemy intros have been changed as well. The game takes control away as we get an intro to the enemy. I much prefer the game not taking control away as they done prior. Dead Space 3 makes use of a lot more puzzles. Some return from Dead Space 2 with a few new additions, some with emphasis on co-op, although they can be done solo. There's even a few cases of flick the switches to get the numbers within a range, a classic staple of survival horror. They're mostly quick and to the point, and nice little palate cleansers. Although beyond just one encounter that I can recall, none make use of dealing with enemies at the same time. A shame, as Dead Space Extraction did this a number of times and was a great addition. The weapon upgrade system has a massive overhaul, and it's a mixed bag as a result. The prior titles, you would use power nodes to upgrade your weapons along a branching path. Power nodes were the only resource to upgrade our weapons and our rig. These choices were permanent, so you had to give some thought to the decisions and what you upgraded. The system has been dropped for a weapon crafting system. No more power nodes, but instead a number of resources will be collected throughout. They'll be used to create weapon parts, although if you explore, you'll find plenty stowed about. You now only hold 2 weapons now instead of 4. However, you can now assemble 2 weapons on the same gun. Primary fire for the top, alt fire for the bottom. You could tweak it further with adding tips to each, which will adjust the way the weapon fires. Attachments can be added for additional benefits, like applying small amounts of stasis to shots. Upgrade circuits can boost the stats. They're not permanent choices and can be swapped out. So as a result, there's much more freedom to experiment with different weapon combinations. And I had a fair amount of fun trying out different weapon combinations. Pretty easy to break things as a result in regards to balance. There's plenty of benches throughout, so if you don't like a weapon combo, you could easily swap out. So it is nice that you're free to tweak to your heart's content. Although it does take away that decision making that was there prior, being mindful of where you want to put your upgrade points into, as those were permanent choices. This system works well with the more action-oriented focus, but clashes with the horror elements. And due to these changes, the game makes use of universal ammo. When I first saw this, red flags were set off in my mind. However, given the changes, I didn't mind as much as I thought it would. Again, another compromise with dialing up the action and dialing back on the horror. You'll be swamped with ammo, and it's easy to craft more if you need it. While we'll find resources throughout, we can also collect them with scavenger bots. This takes some time before they drop them off at a bench. Well, there is a way to speed this up. If you want to, get your credit card out. For just a few dollars, you can make scavenger bots pick up more resources and faster. Yes, the infamous Dead Space 3 microtransactions. This is one of the first major AAA titles with single-player microtransactions. Playing it just recently, there was never any need to consider using them. And from what I understand, this was the same at launch, although someone please correct me if that wasn't the case. I found this quote from the producer of Dead Space 3 talking about microtransactions. There's a lot of players out there, especially players coming from mobile games, who are accustomed to microtransactions. They're like, I need this now. I want this now. They need instant gratification. So we include that option in order to attract those players. So if they're 5,000 tungsten short of this upgrade, they can have it. You know, back in the day there was something called cheat codes where you could do this prior to getting your credit card out. EA was really starting to push to see what they could get away with at this time. I wonder how many potential customers that they lost as a result. However, it's not like you're going to be getting any whales with the system. They might spend $10 to $15 at most. You're not going to get some fucking idiot spending hundreds or thousands of dollars. But hey, it looks like they've learned their lesson for the Dead Space remake that won't have microtransactions. Remember back in the day when you didn't have to mention whether single-player titles had microtransactions? It's a cliche, but it's a classic case of EA getting in their own way of ruining a good thing they had going on. Like everything else in Dead Space 3, level design is a bit of a mixed bag. There's the ship graveyard earlier in the game, and then Planetside in the snow. Both have their strengths and drawbacks, and I think it would have been better if Dead Space 3 focused on one or the other. The ship graveyard section also gives a bit of a preview of what Dead Space 4 could have been. In plans they had for Dead Space 4, creative director Ben Wannett mentioned that they would have taken a non-linear approach, going further into the idea that gets shown here in this section. Here you could explore around various ships, along with a new addition to the series, optional missions. However, the optional missions are better in idea than execution. You'll score some nice gear along the way. Some flesh out some of the backstory that have gone on in these places, although some feel a bit undercooked.
Congratulations. You found me. Kinda stupid, ain't it? I just wanted to live, and now that I'm the only one left, I couldn't give a shit.
There is one exception at the tail end of the game. I'll cover that in the next section as there are heavy spoilers with it. Another big drawback is these optional missions like to reuse these same layouts. It's too bad as they're well designed, it's just disappointing to see the same place used over and over again. It's the co-op where these areas excel at, but more on that shortly. Most of the game takes place planet-side in the snow, and man is it gorgeous. I love snow areas in games. Dead Space 3 delivers this in droves, although it does get more set-piece heavy here, like the climbing or descending cliff sections. These are fine as palate cleansers, but they go on around about 50% longer than they need to. Too bad, as the pacing is mostly great for the most part, something the series has always excelled at. There are bits earlier on dealing with the cold and staying warm. It's more or less like the 0G sections in space but on the ground. They're not really a factor for too long, which is too bad because there were a lot of interesting ways you could have explored these outdoor sections. You could have had snowstorms kick up and greatly reduce vision. Perhaps you could make temporary fires along the way to keep your temperature up. You'd have to keep an eye on your temperature and necromorphs. You could have areas with precious loot, but you need to move quickly to get there before you freeze. But before you know it, you have a suit that takes care of being outside. It's too bad, as it could have been a tweak to the horror formula with high tension. Overall, it's a case of where Dead Space 3 should have focused on one or the other. I would have loved to see the game just fully devote itself to the ice planet, and flesh that out, even with a non-linear approach at Sierra that could have gone further with. One of the biggest changes of Dead Space 3 is co-op, and yes, I sound like a broken record at this point, but it's a mixed bag with the end results. This isn't a new idea. They got something running later in the development of Dead Space 1, but cut it. And it was in Dead Space Extraction, and here it's the same case of being dropped in and out. But it's different than how other games do co-op that are similar to Dead Space. If you're playing single player, your co-op buddy, John Carver, isn't controlled by an AI. He just won't be around at these points, at least gameplay wise. This does lead to a few awkward situations on both sides of the coin. He just shows up at random points in single player, and also in co-op he's just kind of there in some cutscenes. That is the drawback with this approach. You never have to worry about bad AI. However, there are times where you could tell the game was intended for him to be around. There's also a bunch of really interesting ideas here with co-op that they couldn't have done otherwise. When I played, I first did the campaign solo. Afterwards, I spent a bit of time doing quick co-op matches playing as Carver. It was interesting to see things differ as a result, but where things get really interesting is the hallucinations that happen with Carver.
Looks like the path is up here. Hey!
Is everything all right? There's a woman out there. Maybe we should go look for her.
There's a few optional co-op side missions where you could explore the tragic backstory of Carver that you wouldn't have got to otherwise. What makes these sections interesting is that what you see versus what Isaac sees is different. That's a really great blending of the narrative and gameplay. And that's something you couldn't really get away with if split screen was an option here. You could build a whole game around this, but here it's just in a few small sections.
Are we gonna sit here all day? Huh? We've been in this elevator for 5 minutes. Now, are we gonna check this place out or not?
No, let's go.
Sure. I guess some things are better left buried, right, Carver?
As a result of this choice, depending on how you play, things can be pretty jarring with Carver. As I played through the campaign solo, he has this conversation with Isaac near the end of the game where it's like, wait, where did this come from?
I helped get us this far. And that's close enough for all this to count, right?
Count for what?
I don't know, just all the bad I've done.
Oh, shut up, Carver. You're a good man.
But if you play the co-op, it's like, oh okay, I see where he's coming from with this. And another weird note, the only way you could communicate with your partner is through your mic, and you can only mute the mic of your partner in the lobby. There are no in-game voice commands or anything like that, so most conversations I conveyed through were either rolling, crouching, or stomping. Now we're getting into spoiler territory here, and I will have some spoilers for the Mass Effect series. There are some comparisons to be made between the two. Again, like everything in Dead Space 3, the plot is a mixed bag. More of a messy mixed bag here. On one hand, the broad strokes with the lore, the necromorphs, the Brethren moons, the markers, this alien race planet side are all well done. The last fifth or so of the game learning about this alien race is really fascinating. The best optional mission gives more insight into their species, but plenty is still kept vague and up to interpretation.
Final.
Plus, this area is a visual treat. It's why I wish they just focused on being planet-side. More time devoted here would have been great. Then we have the Brethren moons, this seemingly unstoppable Lovecraftian force. There's a lot of overlap between them and the Reapers from Mass Effect. I like to think if we got Dead Space 4, Visceral would have been wise enough to avoid the treatment that Reapers got in Mass Effect 3. Funny to note, as of writing the script, it's almost been a decade since Mass Effect 3 was released. However, it's the character work where things go sideways. And that's why I also bring up Mass Effect as well. The writer that worked on Dead Space 3, Jay Turner, used to work at BioWare as a writer. He worked on Jade Empire, Dragon Age, and the Mass Effect series prior to 3. You know, the time frame when BioWare was still well known for quality character writing, and just quality in general, before character personalities were defined by their sexual preferences. Which does make some of the writing choices here puzzling. Maybe he was better with the lore than the characters? It's been 3 years since the end of Dead Space 2. In that time, Isaac and Ellie started and ended a relationship. Ellie has found something that might help deal with the necromorph threat. Isaac eventually gets dragged in to help. Prior to this, we have a prologue that takes place 200 years ago. To be honest, I don't think this part was even needed. Plus, it doesn't really look like technology evolved much over the last 200 years. Although it does set up this MacGuffin that we have some indication of how we stop the necromorph threat.
You love the Earth, son? Your mom and dad?
Yes, sir, of course.
Good. Glad to hear that.
This intro section with Isaac is rough. The cover system is introduced and we mow down unitologists. Not the best way to get the game started off with Isaac. It feels like something EA wanted to get new players into the game, so let's make it full of action and set pieces. There's also a bit of a red flag here with the unitologists. It always seemed like they were more on the fringes before, but within these 3 years they seem to have taken over everything. This draws another Mass Effect comparison. Remember Cerberus? In Mass Effect 1 and 2, they were a fringe group. Then in Mass Effect 3, it seems like half the galaxy is with Cerberus, considering how many of them we end up mowing down throughout the game. Luckily, the game does find its groove after we get to the ship graveyard. Although, as I said earlier about level design, if the game just focused on planet side, the game could have just started with Isaac arriving here, and that would have been just fine. Ellie's character here suffers from a major case of character assassination. She's more than capable of holding her own in Dead Space 2. That's not the case here. She got some work done on her missing eye, and that wasn't the only thing she got work done on. One of the best aspects of Dead Space 2 was the relationship between Ellie and Isaac and how it grew.
Wait, you're CEC?
Heavy equipment pilot, class 4. You?
Engineer.
Nerd. Figures.
Stay ready and take care of Strauss.
Isaac, no! This is a really bad idea.
I'll stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
It would have made perfect sense for them to be co-op partners here, yet they introduced Carver instead. Carver isn't bad by any stretch, it's just puzzling that they already had things set up with Ellie. She's extremely likable, she works well off Isaac, there was that pre-existing relationship. Did someone at EA think this wouldn't sell? I mean, Resident Evil 5 with its co-op approach did just fine sales-wise. But what's worse here is she's now in a relationship with Norton, who brought us in.
You found us.
Oh, baby. I knew you were deserving to die.
Yeah, there's this asshole Norton. Especially a name like Norton as well, a name I associate with assholes.
Norton, open the cage.
No.
What?
If you want to die here, now's your chance. I'm taking control of this mission again.
Hey, where you going?
Saving Ellie. Norton! Norton! Norton!
We end up with this melodrama love triangle between the three. The game would have worked so much better if he wasn't in it at all, or he wasn't in a relationship with Ellie. Either have Isaac and Ellie still together, or they get back together over the course of the game. Hell, you could still keep Carver in there and have points where they jump back and forth between the two in co-op. Thankfully, we get to kill Norton, who ends up betraying us. This ended up with one of my favorite moments in the game, if unintentional. I got to experience this part in co-op and bonded over a dislike of Norton. And then there's this other asshole, the one he sold us out to, the antagonist Danik. He always seems to get the drop on us due to cutscene incompetence. Plus him and those stupid glasses. Only Elton John can pull that look off, asshole. Although one of the drops he does get on us, I can forgive. It's the Rosetta scene where Isaac gets a vision of what's going on here.
Oh no. No, we've got it all wrong. This isn't the marker homeworld. The aliens, they found the markers just like us, and it spread. It consumed them. It pulled their bodies into the sky to form the final stage. Oh my God, the moon. The moon is the source of the marker signal, not the machine. The moon is convergence. The aliens, they built the machine to freeze the planet, to keep the moon from becoming whole. If the machine shuts down, everything thaws, and convergence is resumed not just here, but everywhere the markers have spread. And this
Here's the key. Turning it all off.
Now, this big info dump in a short period of time is usually a big no-no in storytelling. However, Isaac sounds off kilter here when he's explaining it, like he's trying to piece together fragments, so I could overlook it. Oh, on this point of Rosetta, how come it takes him so long to realize that, hey, you know what? Rosetta's not a person, it's an alien.
Where's her face?
She doesn't have a face. It's not even a she. It's an it. Rosetta's an alien.
What? What does that mean?
As well, there are a few cases of bizarre character choices and more cutscene incompetence. Like where one of the crew die when Isaac tries to save her, and Carver makes a call to let her go. During the scene, I was screaming, "Use your goddamn stasis" at the screen, which they never do. And then later, when Carver takes a codex from Isaac to give to Danik in exchange for Ellie. There was plenty of time to shoot or stasis Danik here, and Carver jeopardizing the mission to get Ellie back goes against what he'd just done previously. And there are plenty of late game moments between Isaac and Ellie that fall flat due to the fact that Isaac killed Norton not that long ago. And before you know it, she's over it and back into Isaac. This was always in the back of my mind in these various moments. These would have had so much more of an impact if Norton was never a factor. So overall, the story is a jumbled mess that screams that it was rushed, and digging in a bit deeper, it seems that that was the case. Earlier plans for Dead Space 3 would have had a Shadow Isaac, a separate character who would taunt Isaac throughout. It sounds like it would have been similar with how Nicole was in her role in Dead Space 2 with Isaac. This would have been co-op as well. Man, there's a lot of really cool directions they could have gone. However, this got dropped for the more action-heavy focus. And you could see some of these interesting ideas with the co-op in the hallucinations with Carver, and I would have loved to see them explore that more with a Shadow Isaac concept. Now, there was another writer listed, Sherry Priest, who worked on Dead Space 3, and she had this to say: "I worked for EA in 2011 as a contributing writer on Dead Space 3. Since I'm listed in the credits as such, I have to assume I'm free to chat about it. That's pretty much all I'm prepared to say on the subject. I haven't played the game and I have no intention of doing so. Therefore, I don't know how much of my material they did or did not use when all is said and done. I remain grateful for the opportunity and value the experience, but I'm not interested in writing for EA again. So take that for what you will." From that, I'm guessing the original plot that they had in mind was her work, and when most of that got scrapped, Jay Turner did a rewrite and we ended up with the story we got for Dead Space 3. Now, this isn't the end of Dead Space 3. There's the DLC Awakened. While sure, it's much more in line with the past titles, the horror is dialed back up. Hallucinations are back here. Isaac and Carver are at each other's throats as a result. There's some great tension here, and something that Dead Space Extraction did with its horror approach, the distrust of others. Now, the DLC does heavily reuse a past area. Granted, this is one of the optional missions, so if you did skip it, it will be unfamiliar territory to you. We get more insight into the Brethren moons. It turns into a race to get back home to warn others. But it turns out, they've been fucking with us the whole time. They know where Earth is, and we end on this cliffhanger.
Lunar Flight Control, this is CMS Terra Nova. Does anyone read us out here?
To be addressed in Dead Space 4, that never happened. Not much has been said about what they had in mind beyond a few snippets for Dead Space 4. Ellie likely would have been the main character, and the ship graveyard approach would have been taken in order to gather up supplies and survive, taking a more non-linear approach. You know, this also would have been a good place for Lexine to come back in. Hell, she would have been a great addition to the Dead Space 3 story. So what did happen with Dead Space and Visceral after the release of Dead Space 3? While sales started strong, Dead Space 3 sales still fell short of EA's lofty goals of 5 million sales. Development for Dead Space 4 was scrapped. This time frame would also be the end of an era for EA, as its then current CEO John Riccitello would resign, with Andrew Wilson, king of the loot boxes, filling that role in the fall of 2013. One project that Visceral would start on would be Project Ragtag. This would be a single-player Star Wars title. EA obtained the rights to develop Star Wars games in early 2013. This was being helmed by Amy Hennig, best known for her work on the Uncharted series. However, due to a number of factors, from an ambitious scope, a small team, clashes on the direction of the game, clashes with the higher up at EA, difficulties working on the IP, and shifting priorities, EA would shut down Visceral Studios in October of 2017. One of the other aspects brought up was the focus on single player. EA was moving away from that, focusing much more on multiplayer, games as a service, and any way possible they could nickel and dime customers. They were always pushing the single player games are done stance, yet time and time again sales of other titles would prove otherwise. So at points they'd still be brought in kicking and screaming into making single player games. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, released in late 2019, was a single-player title with no microtransactions that went on to sell 10 million copies. One aspect that the higher-ups said about Project Ragtag as why it wouldn't do well was it didn't focus on Jedis. However, the success of shows like The Mandalorian prove otherwise. It's a shame that Visceral had to be the one to get the chopping block as a result of all this. You know, I'm still blown away after all these years BioWare is still standing, and haven't been given the old Yeller treatment after the last couple of releases.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no.
After many circulating rumors, EA revealed in the summer of 2021 that a Dead Space remake was in the works. I'm still surprised that they didn't do a remaster of the trilogy to test the waters. It's not like Dead Space is super old and needs a major overhaul. Motive Studios, based out of Montreal, are working on the title. This studio was set up during Project Ragtag to help with development. We haven't seen much at this point, and I do wish them all the best. It just sucks that they had to kill off Visceral Games and then resurrect the corpse of the series to see if something could still be made. Especially after the success of Resident Evil 7 in early 2017, which brought the series back to its horror roots. EA couldn't look at that and say, hey, maybe trying Dead Space 4 again would be worth it. Anyways, the title I'm more keeping an eye on is the Callisto Protocol. This is a spiritual successor to Dead Space, with many of the key players of the Dead Space franchise working on the title. Hopefully we hear more about it this year. Wrapping up here, while it is the worst of the three, I did enjoy Dead Space 3 more than I thought I would given its reputation. The change of setting was well done. The lore it covers is interesting. Crafting various weapon combinations together proves plenty of fun. The co-op aspects are well integrated, especially the optional missions with Carver. However, with shoddy character work, dialing back the horror, and a title full of executive meddling, it falls well short of the masterstroke that the first two games have. It's one of those many tales of EA getting its own way of ruining a good thing and killing it off as a result. But hey, when you're making billions of dollars off Ultimate Team with your sports games that make up nearly a third of your company's yearly revenue, you can make stupid mistakes like this. Instead of using that money to invest into riskier IPs that may or may not pay off, they want every IP to do the same in how it nickels and dimes customers. But the series is coming back, although it never should have been killed off in the first place. Will it be a return to glory or a husk of its former self? I guess we'll have to wait and see. Thanks everyone for watching. If you're still here, do consider checking out my Patreon to support the channel further. You'll get weekly updates of what I'm working on. You'll get featured in the credits here. You'll get access to videos earlier. Thanks everyone. Boulder Punch out.
Fine, let's have a look. I could use a change of scenery.